one of those stories I was going to remember for the rest of my career. I think if you'd just seen it on a TV show, it would, beg a belief.
Opening my contacts book for the first time to reveal the secrets of what it really takes to be a murder detective.
This is a person who calculated what he was going to do.
For somebody who felt they had beat the system.
On the front line, exposing how we solve the most heinous of crimes.
A lot of it is really gut instinct, isn't it?
There was a sinister element to this inquiry.
Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective.
The murder of George Smith in North London in August 2009 was one of the capital's most unusual cases. I'm meeting with the senior investigating officer on the case to understand what really happened, the pressures, the setbacks, and the eventual breakthrough that brought the killer to justice.
My name is Glenn Lloyd. I was a detective inspector and I worked for the Metropolitan Police. I've been fortunate in the many years I've been working on homicide teams to have led and been part of many complex investigations. This is definitely one of the most impactful murders I've dealt with.
Glenn, how are you? Appreciate you coming in. Thank you.
No problem, Steve.
Glenn, the case we're talking about today is from the autumn of 2009. What were you doing back then? What was your role?
I was a detective inspector on a murder team based at Hendon. And I was working with a relatively large team of about 30, 35 people.
So murder teams in London work on what's called a rota system, where basically your team will be on call for a week. Mm-hmm. And incidents would come in, be them murders, suspicious deaths, and one would be high-risk missing people. One of those came into your team, didn't they, around that time?
A missing person that came to my attention on that day, a gentleman by the name of George Smith. The missing person generally had contact with their family on a regular basis, was seen by friends on a regular basis, and was quite a sociable person. And they'd literally just dropped off of the radar. The homicide team became aware and involved in this investigation in early September 2009. George Smith, a male in his early 60s, and he lived in a small flat in Barnet. George had been missing for 2 weeks and it was now getting quite suspicious. It was really out of character. So initially, my team was approached to provide advice.
So one of the first things you're going to do in any incident of a missing person is trying to build up a picture of that person. So who was it and what did you learn about them?
So what we knew about the missing person, George Smith, was that he was estranged from his wife, but had a good relationship with his wife. He had 3 children, aged between 11 and 15. He wasn't in particularly good health, but he had friends and he regularly saw. He liked to drink, he liked to smoke, and he was a likeable, affable person. The last time anyone heard from George was on August the 23rd when he phoned a relative. Barnet Borough Police were then notified he was missing on August the 26th, 3 days later. It was his estranged wife who turned up at the address, having not heard from George for a couple of days. And the reason that his estranged wife had gone round is that George, who always religiously contacted and picked up his children, aged then 11 to 15, hadn't been to collect them, and she couldn't speak to him on the phone. She had her key, and she entered the address to find no sign of George. And that's when she called police.
Emergency Route Service.
So local crime scene investigators had done some initial scoping. It was only a small little flat. There was a main lounge, dining room, a small double bedroom, a bathroom and a kitchen. The address was actually being renovated by the council, and there was plastic sheeting on the floor, and there was sort of a brown stains on the plastic sheeting, which could potentially be blood. We had what we thought was blood. But that in itself didn't indicate something sinister had gone on, because we know George wasn't well and sometimes he coughed up blood. So one of my considerations, had George been ill, had he been taken to hospital, had he walked out of the house, had he clapped somewhere? So we had all these considerations.
As a homicide team, if we decide to take an inquiry, there is a lot of resource that is then put into this inquiry. So if we take an inquiry too early, having not bottomed out what we think we're dealing with, basically we're using a sledgehammer to crack a walnut. And that's where we were at this stage.
It's a bit of a cliche, but when murder detectives, or any detectives really investigate something, you have to keep an open mind. People go missing all the time, and sometimes they can literally disappear off the face of the earth. But that doesn't mean that harm's come to them.
No, exactly, and that was one of my key considerations.
First we knew anything of George Smith, or that anything had happened, was police appeal for information as to his whereabouts. My name's Alex Hayes. I was reporter for the Times series newspapers, which covered the London borough of Barnet. We did a whole load of stories in that first few weeks around George's disappearance. There was a press conference with some of his family where they gave details about George. He was a very popular figure, quite clearly. He was a family man. You know, he was loved by his family. He was someone who people really cared about and valued. And that was an interesting thing, because he wasn't some sort of loner. He's not some sort of isolated character. And at that time, we very much were still treating it as a missing persons. However, the feeling with this was that there was something a little bit more that was going on.
A hugely important part of any missing person inquiry is to look for signs of life of the person that's missing. When we move around, we leave a footprint of our life, be it financial transactions, use of telephone, etc. What were those inquiries telling you? Were you finding any signs of him being alive and well?
George wasn't leaving a footprint. We checked all the ports and passport. It didn't look like he'd gone abroad. His financial life, his digital life, again, had all stopped. It was concerning.
One of your hypotheses that you would be following is that George could have come to harm because of illness. Now, in the UK, if someone is ill and goes into hospital and they don't have any ID on them, it can be very difficult to identify them in a hospital, because essentially what you need to do, you have to contact each hospital, give them a description and say, have you got someone who's come in, fitting this description, who you might not know about? In essence, George could have been anywhere in the UK, and it would have been very difficult to identify for sure, to rule that out, wouldn't it?
Yeah, very much so. So we started with local hospitals to George's address, then sort of moved further out into London and into Hertfordshire. And also, one of the things, if somebody goes missing or they end up in hospital and people don't know who they are after a period of time, they'll actually be recorded on the Police National Computer so we can get a description. So we were monitoring the Police National Computer as well. But in those first 2 or 3 days, we weren't getting everything we wanted, because he had literally just disappeared. Sinister, by choice, or by accident. And I didn't have evidence conclusively to say it was one or the other.
What were your thoughts at that stage?
One of my key elements of work was to, one, undertake an initial detailed forensication of the flat. And what we then did is I attended with the homicide crime scene manager, Neve Smith. Together, we can formulate a strategy.
So I would have overall primacy on the forensic strategy. It was a cradle to grave approach, that you had ownership of a case all the way through from crime scene to court. My name is Neve Smith. I'm a forensic specialist. I worked with the Metropolitan Police. The initial entry to that scene had been for the missing person call from George Smith's ex-wife, and a walkthrough of that flat was done, and an assessment was done of the flat, and they had closed it pending some more inquiries. The scene was untouched at that point. No physical examination had been done of the scene, which was perfect, because you only realistically get one chance to do a crime scene, examine a crime scene properly. And so the decision that had been made to preserve it meant that we were going in and we were able to start that scene right from the beginning.
We still didn't know what we were dealing with. What could the house, George's house, tell us about what's gone on?
So the first walkthrough of the scene, it was myself and the exhibits officer and DI Glenn Lloyd, and the photographer attended at the same time. We do not move anything, we do not touch anything until it is all captured on film.
I noticed there was no sign of forced entry. No one had broken into the premises. There was no broken glass. It didn't appear that the door had been kicked in. So if somebody had come into the property to commit a crime, they had been let into the property willingly.
The premises had been under some decorative updates, so there were some sheeting down to protect the floor, and you had a large dried stain on the floor, and it wasn't known if it actually was blood at that stage. It had not been tested. It was very dark at this stage, as dried blood tends to be, but you could quite clearly see that it had been disturbed whilst it was still wet, and there were wet, swishy marks as if somebody had started to mop it. There had obviously been a clean-up attempt that had been aborted.
We had to send off DNA samples, and it came back it was George's blood. But again, doesn't indicate that something sinister's gone on, particularly when we looked at George's medical background, that he regularly coughed up blood. So again, what I've got to be very careful of is I don't jump to immediate conclusions.
Then you went through the living room into the kitchen, and the kitchen looked normal. Then going into the bathroom, there were a pair of trousers next to the toilet, which were kind of crumpled as if somebody had pulled them down and just stepped out of them. It was a bit Marie Celeste, if you will. Obviously, we had this blood stain, but everything else looked completely normal within the property.
Also, there were some key things there that people said George always took with him. His wallet, his smokes, they were still there. Very unusual thing to find, particularly given the circumstances of what we're investigating.
When it comes to investigating missing people and whether or not it gets raised to a murder investigation to deal with, there is no book you can refer to and say, yes, it now reaches a threshold where it should come to us. A lot of it is really gut instinct, isn't it? It's what sort of a feeling have I got for this? What is the information telling me?
Yeah.
What was it telling you?
My feeling was, having gone to the address, that this could possibly be a little bit more sinister than we originally thought. And it's on that basis that I went to my bosses and said, I think this is something that we should take primacy for and lead, because this has all the makings of a missing person who's been murdered.
In murder investigations, examination of crime scenes can take quite some time. The forensic investigators will be looking for the most minuscule, minute evidence, and that can take an awful long time to find. A scene can be opened and being examined for days, sometimes even weeks in some cases.
Initially, what we needed to do is look at what we can't see. And we can do that using a product called luminol, which reacts with the iron in the blood. So a decision was made, we will spray luminol across the flat to determine whether there's blood that we can't see.
And it became quite clear once we'd used luminol, is that in the kitchen there was significant blood splatter. And then there was drag marks going into the bathroom. And then there was significant deposits of blood in the bathroom. So what we had to do is get specialist scientists, biologists to come in to analyse the blood pattern distribution for them to make an assessment and advise us.
Blood pattern analysis, or BPA as it may be referred to, tells us the story through the blood that is left at the scene. The spray of blood is usually the patterns that are red. We can have a look from the trajectory to the distance to the direction. It can tell us whether somebody was attacked whilst they were standing up, whilst they were laying down. Sometimes it can even tell us how many times they were stabbed, purely by looking at the pattern of the blood that is left behind.
So what we were able to establish is that George had been stabbed 3 times, or appeared to have been stabbed 3 times in the kitchen. Once standing up, once on his knees, and once on the floor.
After that, it would appear that George had, in fact, been brought through to the living room where he had laid on the ground, which is where he bled out and left that pool of blood, and then brought into the bathroom and dismembered in the bath.
As an experienced detective there at the scene, being presented by this, what were your thoughts at that stage? What picture were you building up in your mind?
This was a very cold, calculating person who had gone to an address to commit a really heinous crime. It was a lot of effort. One, to kill someone, then to move them, then to dismember them, and then to clear up. But where was George's body? What had happened to him?
We were having to take it that George was in fact dead, so we were looking for a body. And as the crime scene manager, 2 of the aspects that I would be looking at as to a location for that body, one would be possibly the floorboards of the property, and the other one was there was a garden, there was a private garden out back. We did have a look at having the garden probed, and that was done, and it was ascertained that there had been no disturbance to the garden whatsoever. And when we made inquiries with the council, it was confirmed that underneath the flooring in the house was concrete, so we were able to eliminate that as a possible deposition area as well.
So we knew that he hadn't been buried in the house. So the only way that George could have left that house, it would appear, he was in pieces out of the front door.
When you put that picture together, it paints quite a strong conclusion that actually George has come to harm and George is dead.
Yeah.
But you can't take that for granted, can you? Because it is open to challenge. Clearly George has come to harm there. Your investigation into George's life, what picture was that painting? And was there anything within that that would suggest of why they came to harm?
There was 3 aspects to George's life. There was his estranged wife and children. He had his life with his friends who he used to drink with, smoke with, see every day, chat with. And there was his life in a love triangle. Now this became a key element of the inquiry and where I focus a lot of attention.
But he'd got involved in a relationship with a much younger lady, Carrie Musto, and it was from this relationship that we became aware there was some friction with a local drug dealer by the name of Dwayne Coupedon, who was known as Dean. And basically what had happened is Dwayne was also seeing Carrie Musto, and Carrie was also going to see George, who was very comforting and looked after Carrie.
This was a really interesting turn of events again, because quite clearly, no one expects a 60-year-old man and a 26-year-old man to be involved in some sort of feud over a 30-year-old lady. So there'd been a simmering feud between these 2 men, obviously with Carrie Musto at the centre of this. But police reckon that there was a final straw that broke the camel's back.
What we became aware of is that Dwayne was living a bit of a grey life. He was an illegal immigrant, he was Jamaican nationality, and he was an overstayer. So he didn't really live anywhere, but he stayed with Carrie quite a bit. And at Carrie's, he had a safe, a portable safe, and in it, he had all his life savings and drugs.
It would appear Carrie was in an abusive relationship with Dwayne, and Carrie had recently left Dwayne because of his abusive behaviour and went to George's house and said to George, I need to get back to my flat, but I'm frightened. Dwayne, can you come with me to remove some of my property?
She had her keys, so she returned to the flat with George.
George obviously got Kerry's stuff, but also took a lockbox, which it would later be revealed contained a very large quantity of drugs and also a substantial amount of money, anywhere between £14,000 and £16,000. And that whole stash was worth something in the region of £30,000, which is not an insubstantial amount of money. And the two of them decided that, you know what, they were going to go and live large for a week.
George and Kerry then went down Devon for a few days, staying in a nice hotel, eating out. George had plenty of cash. And Dwayne didn't know where Kerry and George had disappeared to for those few days in Devon. He was constantly phoning Kerry's mum up, asking, "Where's Kerry? I've lost all my money, that's my life savings." George returned back home with Kerry, and Dwayne became aware that it was George that had taken the money, and phone conversations took place between George and Dwayne.
He was furious, and it was quite clear that he was going to do something to take vengeance for what had happened. You know, don't get between a dealer and his drugs, and certainly not a dealer and his money.
We do know that George was not intimidated by Dwayne whatsoever. We noticed this in text messages George sent to Dwayne. "I'm not frightened of you. I know you won't do anything to me."
So essentially, George has ripped off a violent drug dealer.
Yeah,
If you're looking into somebody's life,
definitely. He'd lost his money, he'd lost his drugs. His girlfriend was seeing another man, and this other man, who was a lot older, was openly taunting him. I now believed I had a potential motive for the attack. But the elephant in the room, we did not have a body.
in order for police to prove murder, they will have to prove, firstly, to the Crown Prosecution Service and ultimately at court to a jury, that the victim is no longer alive. When you don't have a body, that's a barrier and a challenge that the police will have to overcome.
When you have a body will give you so many forensic opportunities. You'll know how the person died, what was the likely implement that would cause death, and it may also have links to a suspect's finger marks, DNA, all these things. I didn't have that. So what I'm working off is scientific deducement.
Although a lot of blood had been found in the bathroom and bathtub, it did not prove conclusively that George was no longer alive. We still needed forensic evidence to show that he was in fact dead.
The evidence recovery unit were called in and we did do an examination of the bathroom. The U-bends in the bath were removed and submitted to see if there was any biological matter contained within them, and in fact there was not. But some examinations were done on the tiling, and it was one of the swabs that was done of a tile in the bathroom that actually came back as being skeletal muscle. So it's not something that a surface level injury could result in.
This was a piece of tissue that came from so deep within the human body that it could only have come from someone being cut up in that bath.
It was tiny skeletal remains. We're talking probably about a centimetre long. This sample was sent to the pathologist. The pathologist reported that the absence of blood within the tissue, along with the fragmentation of the tissue, suggested that it must have been removed after the body was drained of blood. This meant post-mortem.
This is where it became really important. It appeared to be post-mortem. George was dead. This was a murder inquiry.
The assumption was whoever had been in there had used water to clean up. So all the taps were forensicated, and it was on one of these taps that we found DNA. That DNA was sent to the lab.
But whose DNA was it? I don't know who had come to George's flat, who had access to his bathroom. I don't know. There was also, in the lounge, a shoe imprint in blood. Again, what does that tell me? I didn't know their value at the time, but I needed to explore what that meant to the inquiry.
You've got lots of competing priorities at this stage, but one of them undoubtedly would be to try and identify where the remains of George had gone.
Yeah.
What did you do to try and do that?
So it was needle in a haystack time.
There was no sign of blood drips be in and out into the street. Whether George's body had been wrapped up in plastic sheets to move body parts, I don't know.
There was no CCTV in the close. Remember, this is before Ring doorbells, so I don't know what had happened, and I don't know how the body was transported, George's body parts.
No neighbours saw any comings and goings from the address. No one ever heard any sounds or any noises in the premises, no arguments. The only thing neighbours could say is they regularly heard George coughing, had a really bad cough, and one day they woke up in the morning and they didn't hear his cough.
There were a few theories advanced around the case itself. Everything from his body being disposed of in a forest, somewhere like Epping Forest, which is a large area. And one theory in particular was that the body was cut up and actually put into different bins, industrial bins, which, then would be incredibly difficult to trace because they'd end up going to different parts, different landfills.
Bearing in mind this is now 2 weeks, just in excess of 2 weeks since George had gone missing, we checked the bins, when the bin collection were, and whether any of his body parts had been found in the bins. Really hard work to do because there was no sign of blood. Bin men had already been, so we're then potentially looking at sites where waste is disposed of. Now, the problem we have, if you look at a site, we can generally identify an area where land waste has been put. It's still an extensive and really expensive piece of inquiry to actually undertake. And it's generally only done if we have a level of certainty that we're going to find something. And I didn't have that at that moment in time. I couldn't get authority to justify that level of resource being spent on searching landfill site just on a hunch.
So the only person who could realistically tell me where and what happened to George was the killer. So my priority was to find the killer.
How did you go about that?
Again, one of the things with most people, they leave footprints in their life. Dwayne wasn't leaving any footprints. He'd essentially disappeared, same as George, off the face of the earth.
Dwayne is now a suspect in a murder inquiry, and we've put a significant amount of work into trying to locate Dwayne. And I personally had done TV appeals and radio appeals, trying to obtain information about where Dwayne was, and that we wanted to talk to him. The only address we had was Carrie's address. Obviously, he was no longer there. He'd gone to ground. So those appeals were really key, and also making sure that local officers were aware of Dwayne and that he was wanted for murder.
Now, in terms of Cooperdon, the longer it takes to get to him, the harder it is then for your ultimate goal of convicting him. So you must have been under immense pressure to get hold of Dwayne.
As you know, the earlier you can arrest a suspect, the more opportunities you have to obtain evidence that links the suspect to the offence. So it really was, at that stage, doing some research and intelligence into Dwayne Cooperdon, what I knew about him and how dangerous I believed he was.
Sometimes police will seek evidence from those within criminal circles, and this can be difficult. There's almost like an unwritten rule that people don't talk to police. They don't trust the police. There's even a term that gets bandied around of snitches get stitches. So that's a real challenge for detectives to get over, asking people from these circles to not only give information, but potentially go into court and give evidence against other criminals.
I was really relying on good old-fashioned policing, people getting out there, asking people in the criminal fraternity, witnesses, anyone who may know where Dwayne was. It was feet on the ground. and using the resources of proactive teams from local policing. One of the things we do know about many criminals, they'll operate in an area they're familiar with. So I was quite confident Dwayne hadn't left the country. He had no other bases elsewhere. He was still going to be around the Barnet area. Police officers who are on the ground who knew the area, that he's out and about, talking to people and just honing in and hopefully relying on information or a sighting. And that's what we got.
So in September 2009, a local officer, a plainclothes officer working on a crime squad, spotted Dwayne near the A41 near a flyover and went to engage with Dwayne, who threw a rucksack over a bridge. But fortunately, Dwayne was stopped. He was arrested for murder and the rucksack was seized. And the contents of that rucksack became really relevant to the inquiry.
So I was sitting in my office when received a phone call saying Dwayne had been arrested and he was in a North London police station. And it was one of those punch-the-air moments.
Arresting somebody for murder, particularly a horrific murder such as this, was a really positive moment for myself, for the team, and also for the family as well, in that we could hopefully try to establish what had gone on and where George was.
We now had the rucksack. So it was an opportunity for some form of forensic retrieval, because in that rucksack were some trainers and they were wet. So had they been washed? Why had they been washed? So we had those considerations.
When we arrested Dwayne, obviously we had a lot of information to put to him in interview. And interviews, contrary to what you see on TV, they're not confrontational. We're not trying to get a confession from people. Interviews are about providing the person who's accused of a crime, provide them with an opportunity to give an account. And nothing in that interview really came out that assisted the inquiry any longer. But obviously, I'm now reasonably convinced Dwayne is our man who is responsible for George's death and dismemberment. Following arrest, we were able to establish that he'd moved in with his mum up in Edgware, so we undertook a search of his premises.
I was informed that they were doing the search of Couperon's house, so I attended as well and met members of the investigation team. We were looking, obviously, for possible weapons. We were looking for anything that was related to the incident.
We searched his bedroom. In his bedroom, we found big tubs of chemicals, which was rather concerning because we didn't know what they were. We didn't know whether they related to possibly acidic bath that may have been used to get rid of George.
Were these chemicals used to dissolve bodies? Immediate consideration. And also we found a file in his paperwork which had all George's details in, his address, his name, his movements. Rather concerning for me, it also had all my details in as well.
You've got a very dangerous individual and they've got your details. What was he planning? So yeah, it's a worrying moment.
In a murder investigation, detectives are likely to seize numerous devices such as phones, tablets, and computers. Part of the examination of these will be to identify any internet searches. You'll be surprised at how many criminals give themselves away by the activity on the internet.
Initially, when we found the chemicals, we shut the scene down because we didn't know what they were. The crime scene manager called up the chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear team to come in to make an assessment of the chemicals. Upon that initial assessment, it was determined those chemicals were linked to drug production and weren't that dangerous. They were removed from the premises, which allowed us to carry on searching.
As part of the search within the property, Couperon's laptop was obviously recovered, and that is a normal protocol for any electronics that are found to be recovered, and they would be submitted to the laboratory for the analysis of what they contained. And of course, What was on Coupeudon's computer did actually play quite a significant part because of what he had Googled and the searches that he had made on that computer.
Can you be convicted of murder without a body? How do you dispose of a body? How do you cut up a body? Pretty conclusive evidence.
He researched forests around London, ways of disposing of a body. He also looked at buying a machete on eBay, and he also bought a car over that time as well.
But I was hoping maybe if we could spot the car on cameras or ANPR, and so we focused on key areas around George's premises at what we thought was the key times of the murder and the disappearance. To no avail, we couldn't pick up this car.
So you've spent a lot of time getting the evidence together for Dwayne that he was responsible for George's death. You're now at a point where you have to make a decision what's going to happen with him. There is only one decision, really, isn't there?
In October 2009, Dwayne was officially charged with murder and appeared at Brent Magistrates Court.
Everything you do as a murder investigator is for one purpose. It's to get the evidence and everything and information to put before a court. Describe that to me. How does that go?
I love the starts of trials because it's the summarisation of all your work. But as confident as I was with all the evidence that we had presented, this was a no-body murder. So it was going to be an interesting trial.
The trial of Dwayne Coupeudon took place at the Central Criminal Court, so you never know what you're going to get when you walk into court. And by the time the opening arguments had been made, it was pretty clear this was a really interesting, if not quite salacious, tale. I think if you'd just seen it on a TV show, it would beg a belief, to be honest with you, some of the facts that came out. It was quite clear as we sat there in the courtroom that this was really painstaking work that had been done. And to be honest with you, it was so impressive at the amount of detail that the police had gone to in order to prove beyond reasonable doubt what they had, suspected all along, that this horrific thing had happened to him in his house.
Fingerprint and biological recovery was undertaken at the property of George Smith. Exhibits were submitted for analysis, and there were various hits that came back. Obviously, George himself, you would expect him to have his own fingerprints in his own home. And we did have a hit with Dwayne Coupeudon on one of the taps in the bathroom.
So the taps in the address became significant DNA evidence. But also, obviously, the throwing away of the rucksack was a significant event. And what came back is we found George Smith's blood on the rucksack and also George Smith's blood in the trainers. So even though the trainers had been washed, there was blood in the stitching of the trainers that matched George Smith. And now what was really important is the trainers matched the footprint in George's premises.
Effectively, I could put Dwayne in George's flat with the bloodied footmark from a trainer that he wore, the blood on the rucksack, and also his DNA on a tap in the bathroom.
Coupeudon didn't take the stand the entire way through his trial. We'd never heard him speak, we'd never heard him or really seen him react to anything. So one piece of evidence that came to light during the trial was Coupeudon was following the case incredibly closely, and to the point where he was actually reading my articles, which was pretty creepy.
We had a really strong case we were presenting to a jury. The biggest challenge for this inquiry was to prove George was dead. Yes, it was aided a little bit by the finding of that skeletal material that the pathologist said was post-mortem. But what was really important, I didn't solely rely on that. I designated a proof of life officer, and it was their job over many months to put together the fact that George had completely disappeared from the planet. And it sounds really simple. It was a massive, massive piece of work, but a vital piece of work. If I solely relied on the fact that a pathologist is saying this tiny bit of skeletal material was post-mortem and it was challenged and removed, I've got nothing else to say. George was dead. So, working in tandem, the forensics and the proof of life supported each other's version of events, that George was dead and George had been murdered.
So any trial will go through certain stages. You sat in court, been there so many times myself, and there's that buzz in the court. We've got a verdict. Everyone shuffles in, and generally the atmosphere, you can cut with a knife. You're an experienced detective, Glenn. You know you can never take these things for granted.
You start doubting yourself. What haven't I done? Oh, what could I have done better? Oh, you sort of think, oh, God, please, 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 please.
What happens?
On the 22nd of July 2010, Dwayne Couperdon was found guilty of the murder of George Smith.
Jury came back incredibly quickly with their verdict, and beyond all reasonable doubt, they were convinced that Dwayne Couperdon had murdered George Smith on August the 22nd.
Guilty. Yes, we've got it. We've got an element of justice for George, for his family, for his friends, and we removed a very dangerous individual from the streets of London.
So before Couperdon was taken down after the verdict was given, Couperdon was given the opportunity to do the right thing and tell the police and the family where he disposed of the body of George Smith. In return, the judge had promised a lighter sentence.
The judge gave Dwayne 24 hours. The following day, Dwayne came back and he refused to say what he'd done with George's body. On the 23rd of July 2010, Dwayne Couperdon was sentenced to life imprisonment for a minimum tariff of 26 years, and also a deportation order was placed on him as well, which means upon serving so much of his sentence, he would be returned back to Jamaica.
But as he was about to be taken down to start his sentence, he just shouted at the judge, "You're crazy." It was a big outburst and something that we hadn't seen, a kind of emotion that we'd never seen from him. This is a man who's incredibly desperate, who's been caught and who knows that he's about to spend a very long time in prison, and it's a last desperate attempt basically to try and show, to try and claim some sort of innocence.
2 months after he was sentenced, I went with my case officer, my detective sergeant, up to York Prison where Dwayne was serving his sentence, to speak to him in an attempt to find out if he would tell us now where George's body was. And he was very ambivalent, never showed any remorse, didn't show remorse in court, didn't show remorse when we talked to him. So I knew then that he would never give up what had happened. I think that tells you everything you need to know about Dwayne Couperdon. This is a person who calculated what he was going to do, took his time about what he was going to do, murdered George in cold blood. I don't think George saw the attack coming. Then had the calmness to dissect George and dispose of his body. So, yeah, one of the most dangerous people I think I've dealt with in over a decade on the Homicide Command.
In terms of the many murder cases I've covered over the years, this one stands out. There's so many factors to it that really make it unique. It's a really tragic case that probably deserved more attention than it got in the wider community and in the media itself.
People want to bury their loved ones. They want to be able to say goodbye.
And I think that's, for me, that's the hardest thing. For the family will never know. They've never been able to lay George to rest in peace.
At the very beginning of this case, you showed instincts that were right. You identified that, in fact, this isn't a missing person, this is a murder. You took on a challenge which isn't easy, which is proving a murder where there isn't a body. And it takes an awful lot of work that, from the outside looking in, I don't think people appreciate. Because if there's any hint that this person might be alive, you will not get a conviction for murder. You couldn't ever find George's body, but the next best thing, which is getting justice for him, getting Coupidon put away for a very long time. So I would like to, on behalf of George's family, just thank you and the team, the work you did in getting that justice for George.
Yeah, thank you very much.
There's no doubt that proving a case where there is no body is difficult, but they showed real tenacity and detective ability and determination. So it was a privilege to hear how Glenn and his team got justice for George.
For their work in the George Smith murder investigation, DI Glenn Lloyd, crime scene manager Neve Smith, and 6 other members of the team were awarded a judge's commendation for solving what was described as a very difficult and complex investigation.